Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we're going over what we're calling exit.
Yep.
So I guess the topic, the core competency formerly known as enterprise value.
That's right, FKA.
Yes, because we've alluded to it on the podcast in the past, and also we've written a lot about it. So we're making the shift to exit. And why are we doing that?
Several reasons. Number one, I think that, when you think about enterprise value, part of the reason you're thinking about enterprise value is ultimately it's exit, right? But so, you're building something, you're helping people understand what it is that you need to do to increase that enterprise value. So getting agreements on sort of the levers and the ways to think about measuring enterprise value. And measuring enterprise value is really important from the perspective of growth and entropy on the opposite side, right? And so all that's really important. But ultimately, as I was working through this core competency, it seemed to me that, we always talk about you want to build at least a stage 5 company that you can either hand off to the next generation or sell to a buyer you'd love to see owning and continuing to back the progress of the company going forward. And that's all about exit, right? Either way you're looking at it's an exit moment. So you're either exiting as an owner or you're exiting as the leader. And it just seemed like that's a thing that we should be helping people really understand and focus on and become really good at. But we didn't have it in any of our 9 core competencies. So to me, exit and enterprise value go really well together. They're mutually supportive of one another. And I also like the fact that exit is a much shorter word than enterprise value. And so that's kind of the short version of the story behind the name change. Under
the, broad umbrella of exit is enterprise value. Mm-hmm. And then within that, there's a time component.
Yeah.
And and a goal, right? As opposed to just sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit broader than that. And then you can go into enterprise value, you can go into all these other things. And the idea is that we're really focusing on moving towards something.
Yes.
And having that in mind and not sort of just
ignoring that. And it goes beyond, right? And exit as a concept is one that, overlaps almost completely with succession planning. And once again, that's not a thing that's talked about really specifically in any of the other 9 core competencies. And so I think the transition enables us to fill a gap that in hindsight was obvious.
We want to make sure that we're trying to cover most everything that makes sense with the 9 core competencies.
Yes.
And if we're leaving a big part of that out, especially depending on what your strategy is, what your business is, industry, right? That is more important for some than others, right? Because you're looking, whatever your time window is, sort of defines that. And so for those with a more defined window, if we're missing that, it's a little bit of a blind spot.
Part of the exit you could, in theory, cover inside of your people, competency, but there's nothing wrong with covering a concept in a couple of different competencies, because that's the nature of these competencies. It is a lot of Venn diagramming, right? Obviously there's data and people have an overlap, as an example, and rocks and people have an overlap, and so vision. There's a lot of overlapping in here. But I think really, sort of leaning into understanding this big idea behind positioning the company so that it can persist for generation after generation. You have to talk about exit.
Right. Everything, all the competencies interact and overlap and everything. And you say that there's a little bit of people in there.
Yeah.
But the part that is people isn't really the part that it's being focused on with exit.
Yeah.
And so even though you have that overlap, it doesn't really cover and it doesn't hammer home the point of being a core competency.
Yeah.
Right. That's more of a peripheral thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Internally, we've had a lot of dialogue about enterprise value versus exit. Mm-hmm. And so where do you see sort of that disconnect and confusion lie in really mastering and focusing, or not focusing, but emphasizing exit?
If you incorporate it into the 9 core competencies, it becomes a topic that you will discuss. as opposed to what the term, I think the phrase you would use is leaving it as something in the fog.
Yeah.
Right. What was it? What would the expression you use?
Do not hide unwanted things in the fog.
Right. So, so internally we have conversations around like, what are my long-term goals and what are the implications and what do we need to do to get from here to there? And what happens if something unplanned happens, right? And so if those things aren't discussed, then we're leaving them in the fog, and they're important things, right? And so just getting clear on where we are and recognizing and being open and honest about, okay, so here's where we are, here's where we're well prepared, here's where we're not so well prepared. Is this a thing we're going to focus on this quarter? Is this a thing we're going to focus on next quarter? Is this a thing we're not going to focus on for a year, 2 years, or 3 years? At what point does that become problematic in that there's a little dissonance inside in terms of, well, we talk about explicit, coherent, and resonant. We haven't been explicit, coherent, and resonant around what are our intentions. It becomes more important, for companies that obviously have third-party investors who have someday, right? They have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors, right? Our investors have fiduciary responsibility to their investors to provide them with liquidity, right? And so, we talk about our exit plan for our current investors is we want to position the company to be able to go public. So we talk about those things, right? And so there's an alignment there. And now it's like, okay, if you're going to do that, what do you need to do in order to be prepared to go public? And well, there's a lot of things that you need to do in order to be prepared to go public versus just to run a business and that someday you're going to sell, right? There's reporting issues that you need to think through. There's a whole host of, right, things that have an impact across various parts of the organization, security as an example, reporting as an example, and including just sort of having, clearer rules of engagement on things that matter more to a public company than they do to a private company. And you just can't, say, well, we're going to go public tomorrow. It takes, I'm not an expert on it. I've only been involved in taking a company public once, but it takes quarters and quarters of work. I think for us, it'll take at least a year, if not 2 years of work and planning to really be well positioned to comfortably and confidently go public. So that's a thing.
And you got to start from that foundation, having that context, just like, all right, we're a year out. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And we had no intentions or any prep going into it.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the more left brain version of vision in a way. And sort of like if you did a Jungian thing, like the shadow side of vision, where it is the things that we are a little bit uncomfortable to talk about because it's out there and it's like, it's a hard thing that you have to focus on and it's not all dreamy and optimistic and that, but it is right. We have to hold ourselves accountable to the thing that we are moving towards.
Yes.
And if we don't do that, right, you can say, it looks like it on the surface. It's all great. But if we're not putting the proper processes, structure, data, reporting and everything to get to that point that we know we want to be at, and if we have investors that we've agreed to be at, that's a huge issue.
Yeah, and there's a big trust component to this, right? Which is, if let's just say the CEO is saying, hey, someday we're going to go public, but nothing's being done in order to actually prepare for that, then it's like, okay, so are you selling me on this idea, but you don't really mean it, right? Because if you meant it, you'd have to there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So then once you say, okay, so now what's all the work that needs to be done? It's like, wow, that's a lot of work. So now are you serious, or are you just like pretending to want to go public someday because it sounds cool, right? It's like, no, you literally now have to start thinking about some serious stuff, right? And the same thing goes for, let's just go a private sale ultimately, right? You don't just, for a whole host of reasons, you just don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to sell my company, right? And the reality is that it takes some serious planning to get the company ready for sale. It takes thinking about, okay, so can this company be sold without it being dependent upon you? If the company's dependent upon you, is it really that saleable, right? What do you need to do in order for the company to be saleable and not dependent upon you? Obviously, that's what we call a stage 5 company. What are the things that you need to do books and records wise? What are the things you need to do with your leadership team, right? What are the things you need to do in terms of maybe there's customer concentration issues, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff, right, around exit, whether it's private or public, that you need to actually lean into and think about. And, for a lot of people, when you're running an organization, you're already maxed out. And so something's got to give if you're going to do the work to be prepared. And, and so obviously if all of a sudden you woke up one day and say, I want to sell it next year, that may be a lot of work now that has to go into that. Maybe you're hiring an investment banker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so just playing the longer game, right? Knowing where, okay, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, thinking through the implications, and now sort of judging yourself, okay, so how far away am I from being able to do this? And then the other thing is, a lot of people talk about this, the economy tends to cycle every 10 years, right? And so what that means is, you go from a recession to a recession, typically, right? We haven't figured out how to get rid of recessions. It's been interesting how we haven't really been in one, knock on wood, of any significance for a while, right? Obviously, you go back to 2008 was the last big one, which is a long time ago now, really. I mean, it's crazy, right? Now we can talk about the COVID and all that, which had a lot of elements of a recession, but it really wasn't quite a recession. It was different than that. But typically, it's about every 10 years. And then typically, right, if you're in a recession, that's a really bad time to sell a business, right? It's just like no one has the capital. No one wants to take on the risk. So there's moments where you don't want to sell your company. Then there are moments where, the company's performing, okay. And then there are moments where the company's really, really performing well. And this is like an amazing time to sell the company. And you never know exactly where, I have 45 whatever years in business, I have a sense for good times versus bad times versus mediocre times to sell a business. But no, there's no crystal ball. And so if you want to someday be prepared to sell the business or to take the business public, right, you have to prepare, and you have to recognize that the timing won't always be your friend. So if that's on the horizon, then you should be doing the work and be prepared. But, the truth is you may prepare just in time to not sell because this is a bad time to sell. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. Right. Because you have to be able to adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
But also in part of that and having that always be there, you are making continuous adjustments with that in mind.
Yeah.
And you're not letting things get out of order, because if you do want to sell in a year for some reason, right, you don't want to get to that point and be like, oh, we have nothing. Everything is out of sorts. Nothing is ready. And it's going to take tons of work. And we're not going to be able to focus on actually running the business and making the business good.
And those thoughts are going to likely come to you, probabilistically, right? They're going to come to you during really good times. Yeah. But then if those really good times don't last for those windows where it's a really good time to do that, they're not 10 years, they're, let's say it's 3 years, or 2 years. And all of a sudden you're a couple of years into good times, you're like, ooh, now would be a good time. But I'm not prepared. Now I got to spend a couple more years. And by the time you get ready, it's all of a sudden, oops, no longer is a good time. That's one of the many reasons why I believe, you need stage 5 companies are the companies that have gotten to the place where they're literally pretty confident in planning out 5 to 10 years, and they can be ready for the window for the exit.
So as we talked about from the running business side, but from the investor side, from someone, from looking at businesses that do this poorly and do this well, what's your experience? What's your interpretation on that?
What's the difference between the businesses that do it poorly and do it well?
Experience from your end, and then what is that like? What do the outcomes look like?
Well,
both from a relationship as you're trying to develop, as you're trying to develop a relationship with the people you're investing in.
Yeah.
And then also how those businesses perform.
Yeah. Well, I think at the risk of stating the obvious, if you go through a good exit planning process, it is going to force you to look at a broad range of disciplines that are associated with just running a business well and positioning it well, right? Like, it'll force you, as an example, if you have, I'm just going to say this 35% customer concentration rate, and it's like, oh, that's an issue, right? Because it just means that the predictability of the future cash flow streams is a little bit wonkier because you lose that one customer, right? That's a big thing. And for some businesses, it's like, you go from making good money to making no money or losing money. So it forces you to look at some disciplines that are associated with just running your organization. It forces you to look at disciplines with regard to not just your customers, but what are the disciplines we have in place, as an example, for having contracts with our employees, and specifically maybe around IP, as an example, right? It just forces you into a lot of hygiene that not only is good for positioning the company for exit, but it's just good business practice. Yeah.
It's discipline.
It's
discipline. Hygiene, right?
And if this is a good discipline and it's a known discipline, then it's easier for me as a leader to say, hey guys, right? This isn't just Mark saying we need to do this, right? This is like 101 or 202 or 303 of running a business, right? So we got to do these things. It's not just because I say so. Because a lot of times, that's how it feels. You're like, well, we need to do this better. Why? Well, these are the reasons why. Okay, that makes more sense, right? As opposed to just because I say so. And then you can have objective conversations. You can even have objective third parties come in and say, hey, right? Yeah, these things that, your crazy visionary is saying are important. They are important, and these are the reasons why. And by the way, especially if you have people who are also, shareholders with you, your leadership team or the whole company, which obviously is what we have, right? It's like, hey guys, if we're not good at this stuff, we're going to trade it be literally 40% less valuable than if we just do these things. That's a pretty compelling return on effort. And that's a pretty compelling reason to say, okay, I get that, right? These are the things that we need to do. And here's where we are, and here's what we need to focus on. And here are, like what probably could not only be good for us to get done someday, but this is better done sooner rather than later. These other things, they can wait, like process. We've talked about that on numerous occasions. These things can wait because these other things are more important. So let's prioritize those, and let's make sure we all have the context around why we have the priorities we do. Back to explicit, coherent, and resonant. Okay, yep, that makes sense. These are the reasons why we're doing it. We can explain that. People can ask a bunch of questions, and they're like, okay, I can run with the ball, and you're like, good. Just run and, let me know in 90 days, right? If it's a rock, right? Did we get it done? And check in during the quarter, make sure we're on track to hit the milestones associated with that rock. But there's no question that when you go through a process like this, getting prepared, you're going to have a bunch of rocks. There's just going to be a bunch of stuff you're going to be working on. Depends on obviously what stage of development you are and how tight a ship you run, but 10 to 20 rocks probably. For a lot of businesses to really get prepared. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so how much capacity do you have to do that stuff? And over what period of time is it going to take? Right. Obviously if you want to do that in 1 year, that's a lot. Right. So.
And you can take the rocks and how many people are involved with the thing. You just get if you're ideally you'd want to one rock per person per quarter times the team size. And it's like, oh, we got to rush it. Then it's like, oh, we're doing 1 to 2 rocks.
Right. But we got all this other stuff going on, stuff that we can't ignore.
Yeah. Right. It's a foundational priority. Mm-hmm. And given that it's so explicit and foundational, it's not optional.
Right.
So what's that? It's like the book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, whatever. I think the first part of it is
Og.
Yeah. The first thing is form good habits and become a slave to them. And it's kind of the same idea, right? But at scale for the company. And when you do that at scale with a bunch of people involved, it needs to be very explicit.
Yeah.
And everybody needs to get on board. And it's just, we have to do this.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
Right.
There's nothing sexy about it.
Yeah.
It's just, we need to have this. We need to stay on it.
Yeah.
Given that there is that tension between, right, let's say we're a year and a half ish and we want to approach that.
Right.
And we're in a okay spot. We're in a decent spot.
Right.
Not amazing at this, but we've been doing the work.
Yeah.
How much time do you allocate, right, across for the people that are directly involved with this, right? We talk about rocks.
Right.
What is the maximum amount of time that you should allocate to focusing on that exit as opposed to doing the work that needs to be done, right? The day-to-day, the running the business side of things.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, so let's just say for the sake of this conversation that this work is a lot of the work that needs to be done and needs to be done under the CFO, right? Under their organization. Let's just say for the sake of this conversation that the work that needs to be done realistically is going to take a year. Now the question is how much, how many hours, just to make it simple, right, is this going to take? And do we have the capacity to do this? And if we don't have the capacity to do this, can we get a third party to help us get prepared for this, right? Or, if we look at what everybody's got on their day-to-day, week-to-week, associated with their day-to-day, week-to-week efforts, let's just say for the sake of this conversation that you're talking about, on average people, can easily give you 45 hours per week. And now all of a sudden, if we're going to do this all by ourselves, it's going to mean that each of them is going to need to give us 10 hours per week, but they don't have it, right? They've only got like 5 hours to 7 hours that they can do it. So you got to make a decision, right? Are we going to go take longer? Are we going to use a third party? Are we going to hire someone else internally to work on something that's not going to be a forever work, right? So these are the decisions that, leadership teams get to make. It's like, okay, so how serious are we, and what are the implications, and what are the options that we have in order to get this done? So there's no right answer. It's just about, how good are you at understanding what your day-to-day, week-to-week roles and accountabilities demand on average for the upcoming quarters. As an example, if you think that you're going to have, I'm just saying 10 hours per week per person in that department during audit season, you're probably crazy, right? Because that's typically where everybody's, sort of maxed out a little bit, right? Annual planning season is another one where you tend to be maxed out a little bit. So you have those two seasons. Typically, one is Q4 and one is Q1, right? So Q4 is planning, Q1 is audit, and everything else associated with it. So the reality is, you probably say, hey, we can do a little bit of work in Q4 and Q1, but we can do more work in Q2 and Q3. So as we're thinking through this next year, right? Let's be mindful of all that and plan accordingly. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And if you're dealing with those 6-month chunks, basically, and you're entering Q4 and you're like, we want to start working on this. We want to lay that groundwork. It's like, nope, this is not the time to do that.
Right.
Right. And then so you have to wait.
And then now let's throw one more thing on there. Let's say you have a capital raise going on as well, right? So, that typically takes at least 90 days. And so, in your finance department, oftentimes, 3/4 of the year is not a great time for working on this stuff. So, and then you say, well, okay, so this is why it gets back to sometimes this is a multi-year effort if you're just being realistic about it all, right? Specifically with regard to your finance department. They may just not have the capacity unless, once again, you hire some resources, either internally or externally, to assist you with this because you feel like you got to move faster than you can with your current team.
Yeah. Because if you are in that financial position where you are doing audits, annual planning, and you're raising capital, and you have a quarter a year. And so that's, you're not going to have more than 2 rocks for the CFO in that situation. Yeah. So 2 years, you get 4 rocks there from a C-suite member. Yeah. It's like, that's not, right. That's not much. Right. And so it puts even more importance on having that having you keep up with those things and keep up with that hygiene instead of trying to cram it into the last minute because you just can't do it.
Yeah. And then this gets back to, selling the company versus going public, right? So the process associated with getting ready to go public is a more onerous, more work needs to be done process than the process of selling a company or raising capital. Those are three big sort of things that you can see having a lot of demand on the office of the CFO, right? That organization. And so, you're sitting there thinking about, okay, so what are the next things that we need to be prepared to do, and what are the implications? And there's only so many hours in a day, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're sort of biased as we are towards genuinely, respecting people's work-life harmony, right? Now, if you got an organization where you love to run it at the red line, and suffer the consequences, whether they're stressed out people and that environment, or people dropping the ball in that environment, or these are the things you got to think through.
Yeah, if you want to have a really bright burning flame and you don't care about churn, and you have a short window. Yeah. Right. That's a game that people play.
Right. And then imagine now you're doing all that right in front of, let's just say, an exit. And so, the investors are interviewing people and it's like, well, blah, 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 right? The buyers are, and they're like, well, this place feels kind of toxic. Okay. If we'd been a little more thoughtful about all this, maybe we wouldn't have this level of toxicity right before, where people are taking a really close look at how things are going and where things are going. So,
and we always talk about extra mile. And if you're running it full throttle, right? And then you don't have that extra mile left in the tank. There's no boost button there.
No. Yeah.
So
you're all out of what's the Noxus?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know how deep to go into the car analogy right now. There's you threw a tune on it and you already voided the warranty. Yeah. You're like, it's fine. Yeah. Right? I don't need this thing to last 100,000 miles. I'm good with a great 5,000 miles.
As someone who's invested in over 100 companies and gone through dozens and dozens of the due diligence processes associated therewith, right? You may think that people won't see, right, underneath the hood and see that things are like there's cracks in the engine or there's other stuff going on there. But, the probability that the slight messes that's been created it won't be seen is very low in my opinion. So once again, that's why don't assume you're going to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, right? They're going to, and there's all these, games, and we used to get a kick out of, there's a thing called adjusted EBITDA, and it adjusts, right? And you're like, every single year has adjustments. Every single year has adjustments, right? So what's that say? Okay, you can tell us that those are all real adjustments, or we can sit here and say, well, if you're adjusting every single year, that tells us a lot about the competency of the senior leadership team, doesn't it? Right? Because it's doing all this stuff. Oh no, that was dumb. Don't worry about that. That'll never happen again. Well, if I've got something that'll never happen again every single year, guess what? It's probably going to happen again, right? Or you know that you're going to need to go in there and have some heavy lifting associated with upgrading the leadership team. And if that's the case, that when you're going through that process, it's inevitable that you're going to have expenses that you didn't anticipate, that the engine isn't going to be running on all 8 cylinders because you're literally changing out your cylinders to keep the metaphor going, right? And all that stuff's going to get taken into consideration in terms of the exit value, the multiple, whatever it is, right? So just, right. That's why, we want to help people just really be thoughtful about this stuff, play the long game, recognize the nature of the game, recognize the nature of the rules, recognize the nature of the officials, right? The people who are going to come in and analyze it, whether it's the accounting firms or the investment banker who's ever going to be involved, and just do the right things.
And those are pretty standard.
They are.
It's just pretty explicit.
They are.
It's out there. It's not going to come out of nowhere.
Yeah. This isn't magical stuff that's never been done, right?
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of companies go through some form of an exit every single year. We know how to do this.
Feels like a good spot to end on.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.